Heidi Hutner on Coffee with Hx2, and today I'll be speaking with Leona Morgan from New Mexico. She is a uranium mining activist, indigenous activist, and a Navajo. So welcome, Leona. So glad to have you on. I've heard you speak many times, and I know you're doing really powerful and incredible work on uranium issues and uranium pollution, a really important environmental justice issue. So could you tell us about your organization, Diné No Nukes?
Yes, like you said, I'm Diné. I'm Navajo from New Mexico, and my family's health has been impacted by the past uranium mining. And so I was working for several years to stop a new in situ leach uranium mine in northwestern New Mexico. And for several years, I worked with different organizations, but a lot of the things I noticed was that people are in real need of basic education. And so Diné No Nukes is an organization I started with a couple of colleagues in 2014, and our focus is primarily education. And so we have one major project that's called the Radiation Monitoring Project that I'd like to tell you more about today.
So tell us about the project. What is it? And also, if you could describe to us, what is the problem that you're trying to resolve? Because I know there's a lot of pollution remaining from uranium mine pits. So could you just describe to us what that is and give us a basic education?
Sure, yeah. It's basically across the country, there's over 15,000 abandoned uranium mines, and there's no law in place that is calling to clean up these radioactive sites. And so most of these are conventional uranium mines, which would either be underground mines, open pit mines, or mines that would go like into the side of a mountain or a place where there's uranium. So there's all different types of conventional mines. And so the major problem is that because of things like the 1872 mining law and the rush for uranium and the boom in the mid 20th century, that occurred before the National Environmental Policy Act was passed. So some of these things that occurred before there was laws in place for public input or things like, for instance, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was passed in 2007. That calls for the free, informed, and prior consent by Native people when there's environmental impacts to the land. That was well over 50 years after the boom occurred, mostly in the western states. And so I'm in New Mexico, and the state with the most abandoned mines is Colorado. So the thing about us as a Navajo nation, my tribe is actually working with the federal government to get a lot of these mines cleaned up. EPA has identified 523 distinct sites. That's not all of them, but these sites are in a process of remediation. It's almost impossible to clean up some places, especially the groundwater, because of it's really not impossible, but because of the really expensive cost, the government, this is the more impossible part, is getting Congress to approve payment for cleaning up groundwater and radioactivity. So what happens is a lot of times these places are just contained. They put a lot of new soil on top of places to reduce the amount of to try to stop the transport of mine waste. And so that's the major problem, is the abandoned uranium mines. The other issue is that the companies that are pushing for new mining in New Mexico, we have several that are trying to start new mining. Ultimately, the economics of uranium mining is just not stable, and it's not something that's going to benefit local communities. It'll bring in some dollars for the time of the mining, but a lot of the money is not going to go to local workers or local communities, but will be used by the workers who are often from out of state. That will go to their local economies. And so there's a lot of problems with the waste and the economics. But for us as Native people, a lot of the mining that we're looking at is on sacred lands. So in Arizona, there's the Grand Canyon. In South Dakota, there's the Black Hills. And the site that I'm really concerned about in New Mexico is Mount Taylor, which we call Tzotzil, which is one of our four sacred mountains. And so a lot of the basics about the dangers of uranium, the impacts to health, and different operations, companies, the politics, all of that stuff is what we and myself, try to educate people on. Depending what community it is, I would fashion a presentation for that specific community to explain the issue that is most relevant to them. But in the process of doing all this education, the thing I noticed is that people really do not understand what is radiation and radioactivity. And I myself, I'm not an expert. And so I looked into this with some colleagues of mine, and I invited a couple of entities to be involved in this thing we call the Radiation Monitoring Project. And so Dave Kraft of Nuclear Information Energy Service out of Chicago and Yuko Tonahira out of Brooklyn are two people that I work very closely with the Radiation Monitoring Project to design relevant training to people in contaminated places so that they can get the tools to learn what is the levels of radioactivity in their community. And so what we've done is fundraise to purchase radiation detectors and then go into the community and help to do the training by not just providing the education, but also providing the device that they need to measure the radioactivity. And so in all of my educational talks, I think the most confusing thing especially for local folks near these places is the radioactivity, because it's something you cannot sense with your human body, but you need special equipment to do so. And that's why we started the project.
And assuming you're going to find radiation, I'm sure you have, then what are people to do with that information?
Well, for now, what we're doing ultimately is that we are trying to get background radiation. We're not encouraging people to go into dangerous places that are highly contaminated. And we stress that to the people we're training, is that we do not want them to expose themselves unnecessarily. And so what we're hoping is that folks will use the device to get background radiation and understand what is happening in their areas, either around their home, workplaces, schools. And some folks want to go to sites that are being proposed for new development. And so if you're going to a site that was already mined, it's going to be contaminated and you will be exposing yourself. So one of the things that we think this is useful for is people fighting new mining. So people who are fighting something that hasn't been built yet. I mean, ultimately, if there is a new contamination, that would give people the documentation to show if the company does start mining. I mean, we don't want these things to happen. So a lot of folks are actively challenging the government agencies and the companies so that they do not start mining. But what we've found is that during the uranium boom, the government did not have, well, they say they don't have the data for what the background levels were before the mining started. And so they rely on company data, which ultimately we don't trust. And in several instances, the company says it doesn't have data, because I'm sure the data they took, like in the 40s and the 50s, would show lower levels of radiation. And so what the government is cleaning up to are elevated levels of radiation. And so today, that practice, I'm sure, would happen again if the people and the communities themselves don't have third-party info, which would be their own collection of readings over time, or at a certain point, I'm sure they would also for like water sources, send away samples to labs to get certified data to show these are the background levels. And so if the mining should occur, then the company would be subjected to cleanup as close as possible to those levels. Again, I said it's almost impossible to clean up. So what happens in every instance of uranium mining, the companies they never clean up to the actual background. They clean up to a level that they will say to the government, we cleaned up as much as we can, and we just can't get back to that level it was before. So they get these permits for allowable, what they call alternate concentration levels. So oftentimes when companies can't clean up all the way to the pre-existing conditions, they're allowed to basically just leave the project once they've shown that they've cleaned up as much as they could, which is not acceptable to the communities.
So Leon, let me ask you a question, because I think for a lot of people, they don't get the context. This land is primarily reservation land. It's Navajo reservation land.
Well, the land.
And just before you go on, just to kind of contextualize it, I think one of the things that often people don't realize, so obviously Native American people were colonized, land was appropriated, cultures were displaced, people were moved, and we assume that all the terrible things that happened to indigenous peoples happened several hundred years ago. But what's happening now is this sort of double crime of the American government or various companies are going in and mining on your lands and leaving open pit, dangerous remains from uranium tailings, right? And leaving it for your people. And you are being made sick by it. We know uranium causes cancer and other disease, birth defects, infertility, all kinds of problems. And so you're sort of left with this. And also I want to just kind of clarify that uranium was mined for bombs during World War II, right, to make nuclear bombs and for nuclear power. So you're sort of left with this legacy of war on your land. And now, from what I understand, they want to start mining again to build more bombs. Is that correct? And they need the uranium to do that?
Well, the actual end use has not been clearly stipulated for the sites that we're looking at. So we don't know if the uranium would be going to power plants or for the nuclear weapons overhaul. So what we've, just to go back to your previous question, the lands that I'm talking about, I'm kind of making a general picture. The things I'm explaining happen all over the country. Specifically in our area, on Navajo Nation, I mentioned that there is some cleanup happening where the Navajo Nation tribal government is working with the federal, the EPA, and other agencies. That's only unique to Navajo Nation. Across the country, there is not any cleanup happening on the other 14,500 plus abandoned uranium mines. So just to clarify, on our tribes, on our land, on the jurisdiction of the Navajo Nation, there is a law which our tribe has passed to put a ban or a moratorium on uranium mining. And this is not the case on other tribal lands. So for us, there is no mining happening on our reservation, and there cannot be according to our law. However, there are several little windows or little islands of land within the Navajo Nation. There's these pockets of land, especially in this place called the Checkerboard area, which is, if you look at a Google map and you zoom into northwestern New Mexico, you can see the various colors of the map because it's a checkerboard of several different land statuses, either state, federal, tribal, or private. And so in the places that are within our homelands, even if, so when I talk about our homelands, that's a huge expanse of land between the four sacred mountains. And it's a lot bigger than what our current Navajo Nation is today. And so the mining that's happening, the mining that is being proposed in New Mexico, one of the areas of concern is Mount Taylor, which is a sacred site, which we that was one of the boundaries of our traditional homelands that we consider, part of our traditional homelands and very sacred, not just to Navajo, but to other tribes. That mountain is on Forest Service land, and some of the areas are privately owned or state land. So one of the projects that we're concerned about is a new mine that's being proposed that is half, part of it is on federal Forest Service land, subject to 1872 mining law, and the other is state land. But all over the country, in other parts, in places where there's active mining, the laws, they vary from state to state. How they permit mining is different. But the thing I wanted to emphasize is that on Navajo Nation, we do not have uranium mining currently, and as long as our moratorium is in place, we shouldn't have any mining in the future. But the places that are at stake are places, the whole country, like you said, the land was colonized, and so before the United States, this was all indigenous lands. So no matter where you go, the local community that's indigenous to where these sites are will be affected. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
It does.
But
And unfortunately, we have to wrap up. But what I want to ask you, just as a last comment, if you could, so for many people, they really don't know about this, and they don't understand. We often hear nuclear is clean, nuclear is safe. And I guess if you could just say a couple of words, and then this is, just if you quickly, if you could, because our time is limited, about that there's a whole cycle here, and that there's a piece that starts in the extraction of uranium and what that's doing to many communities, and that that piece is often forgotten.
Yeah, sure. So because of like you said, the legacy from the war, World War II and the Cold War, not just Navajo, but indigenous people and American citizens all over the country will be living with a legacy of radioactive waste for as long as it takes the federal government to pay for the mess it created. The radioactivity in every community is different, but we know that these places will be contaminated for generations, and it doesn't make sense to do any more mining. We should not allow any new mining at all, not for nuclear energy, and definitely not for nuclear weapons, because uranium mining is definitely something that's overlooked, which is part of the nuclear fuel chain. And so when people are looking at nuclear power as a solution to climate change, they need to consider where the fuel for that comes from, and they need to consider the extractive processes, which are not included in the Clean Power Plan. And so that's one of the reasons why people are saying that this could be a solution, because nuclear power is clean. That's not. It's not. As my friend says, it's a dirty lie. So we know it because we're living with, increases in cancer and different health problems that we are all facing across the West because of these contaminated sites.
Well, I thank you so much. That's a really, really important message for all of us to hear. And I thank you for your good work. And I look forward to speaking to you again, I hope soon. So take good care.
Okay. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you for having me on the show. I'll send you our links to our project and our website.
Wonderful. I'd like to have those, and we'll post those on my site. So thank you very much. So
Great.
that was Coffee with H2 with Leona Morgan, a Navajo uranium activist doing really important educational work to help her people. It's an important health issue, an environmental issue, and we look forward to having more shows with her and more shows on such issues. You can see other shows of Coffee with H2 on my website, HeidiHutner.com.